Well, we have a lot of material for our fourth lecture, The End of Antiquity in the Middle Ages. We're going to go all the way through Augustine. We're going to look at the three arts of the Middle Ages. We're going to be looking at grammarians and encyclopedists. A lot of people think that the Middle Ages doesn't have an awful lot to offer in terms of rhetoric, rhetorical theory, and rhetorical history. It does. It's quite extensive, and we're going to try to cover it in a single lecture here. We're only going to be able to hit just barely the highlights of each of these works. But remember, the function of these online lectures really are not to go into great detail. They're just simply to keep your eye to keep you to give you an opportunity to keep your eyes open for some important things to find and look for in the texts, or to be mindful of in the texts. I'm going to start with St. Augustine's On Christian Doctrine. I won't go into a big, extensive biography of Augustine. You know how important he is, probably, in Western history and Western thought. Augustine was, of course, originally a non-Christian, actually converted to Christianity, and if you read his autobiography, it's quite an interesting, fascinating text. We don't have time to go into that, but suffice it to say that he was a convert to Christianity right at the very, very end of the Roman Empire, prior to the barbarian invasions. In fact, it's likely that his life was taken as part of one of the invasions from outside of the Roman Empire. Um, Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, the purpose of the piece, of course, is to advise the Christian pastor on interpreting and conveying the truth of Scriptures, providing order to the audience. And that's one of the most important things that he's trying to underscore here, is the pastor's role to provide order in terms of the structure and the logical approach to the message for the audience. Books 1 through 3 were the ones that he wrote while he was Bishop of Hippo. One of the things that's quite interesting is in his autobiography, you don't have that selection here, but his autobiography, he details his early life and goes into his early choices of occupation. He was an exceptionally good student. He hated the fact that when he was a little kid, he got beaten in school for not knowing his lessons. But he became an exceptional student and a very, very talented speaker. And his parents sort of wanted him to go into law or public speaking or politics or something like that. And of course, as is so typical of people of his age, he simply wasn't that interested in it. And think about this, a legal career or political career in the late empire, it's got to be, one of the less exciting kinds of things to go into. That was not where people's attention was being turned. When your world is caving in, when it's turning inside out, when what you've known and grew up with in terms of the political establishment is changing radically before your eyes, where everyone you know and grew up with is changing their religion, their philosophy, their way of life, that the political system, you look around and see nothing but corruption and decay, and it's a matter of how long is this system going to last before we plunge ourselves into utter chaos. You can understand why the prospect of a public career, of a secularly successful career, is something that just wasn't as appealing. What was appealing was a sort of turning inward, a more philosophical, a deeper, more theologically based existence. And so that's what Augustine and so many of the leading intellectuals of the time were really not focused on the external world. They wanted answers to deeper questions, because what they saw around them is an external world that was not reliable, that was not easily understandable, and was transient, in fact. So we could go into that forever. We won't do that. But the first three books were written while he was Bishop of Hippo. Just understand that he was a terrific speaker, but he just saw that public speaking for its own sake, legal arguments, epidictic speeches, he thought they were shams and phonies. In fact, he reaches a kind of spiritual crisis when he writes a speech about the government, about the emperor, and he says, it was a great speech. The only problem was it was full of lies, and I was sick of myself. I was sick to my stomach of myself for making such a speech. And he's looking at the question of, do I want to waste my life making stupid things like this, stupid arguments in front of courts and legal bodies that I don't really believe, or do I want to live for something I actually believe in? Now, book 4 is on rhetoric itself, and the big ideas in there are several. One, eloquence is separate from wisdom, and it can be achieved without training. Now, that is an important thing. Eloquence is separate from wisdom. Wisdom is one thing, right? The race, if you want to look at it the way Cicero looks at it in the Brutus and other the race, the thing, okay, the wisdom is separate from the verba, the eloquence, or the way you put it. Okay. Notice, remember that Cicero and a lot of other people too in the ancient world were trying to get this marriage between race and verba, and Cicero really does this magnificent job with it. So does Longinus, by the way, as we said. But he's moving back towards a separation of race and verba. You know, there's the clothing, and then there's the thought itself. There are things and there are words. And what you're seeing when you see Augustine do this is you're looking at a hard left-hand turn back towards Platonic idealism. Whereas the Roman way of thinking, whether it's Cicero or Longinus or even the Ad Herennium, is looking at this kind of union of race and verba. You know, you can't separate the idea from the words in which it is expressed. Here's Augustine, who finds the Platonic view much more appealing. And in fact, all of Christianity, especially the early teachings of the church, does look at, especially in the letters of Paul, looks at this separation from body and soul, this Pauline dualism. And so that dualism that's embraced by Paul and other early church fathers is very, very much, well, at least if it's not the same as Platonic idealism, it sure does rhyme with it in a way, intellectually anyway. This view of the world that there are two halves there. There's good and bad, there's spirit and matter, there's body, there's soul, all of that sort of thing. So it's not a surprise that somebody like Augustine, having embraced Christianity as a young adult, by the time he's writing Book 4, he's really looking at things from more of a Platonic perspective, but it's only because he's a Christian, actually, not necessarily because he just fell in love with Plato so much. Nevertheless, pastors really can't afford to assume that hearers will accept Christian truth without rhetoric. So there's a value in rhetoric. In other words, it's wisdom that's most important. Eloquence can be achieved without training. It's not often, and it's not the best way to do things. But what's most important is wisdom. It's truth, capital T, Christian truth. Eloquence can occur without training. We'll see how later. But the most important thing is having that knowledge of Christian truth. And but even so, pastors just can't afford to assume that your audience, potential converts, will accept Christianity without rhetoric. It's not required to gain truth, but it is helpful. Okay. Next, rhetoric must be employed for people's good. So here he's very much like Cicero and Isocrates. He's not, but now look at the difference here. He believes that rhetoric needs to be employed for people's good, but for the people's good, but he's not like Cicero and Isocrates in that it's not a civic or a patriotic notion of people's good. No. In Cicero and Isocrates, it's the civitas that is most important. Here with Augustine, when he's talking about the good of the people, he's talking about their spiritual well-being, not their patriotic or civic well-being. It's not something he does for country. It's something he does for God. It's not something he does for the state. It's something he does for the church, the body of believers. So it's not a civic or patriotic notion of people's good or the better good or the good of the community. It's a spiritual or ecclesiastical motivation there. So ultimately, one of the things that he's known for is turning the second sophistic. And you remember in the late Empire, the movement known as the Second Sophistic is very prominent. They're sort of rediscovering these Greek guys, and they're very interested in style, and they're very interested in sort of verbal pyrotechnics in a way, very excessive in some people's minds. He turns the Second Sophistic's secular epideictic oratory into homiletic uses. In other words, he's interested in sort of taking from the Second Sophistic the emphasis on style, and just taking the best of that and using it for homilies, which are sort of lesson teaching sermons, right? How to be an honest person, or stay away from drinking, and don't gamble. Those are homiletic sermons, how to live your life kind of sermons, not theology, right? Not a theological sermon on transubstantiation. So he's really focused on, let's go out there, let's take the stylistic sort of embellishment that you do see with the Second Sophistic guys, and let's take some of that ornamentation and let's use it to make the truth of Christianity more appealing and accessible for the masses. That's where he's going with that.